When I first set foot in American soil in 1831, I expected to find a nation drunk on equality, perhaps sacrificing liberty for democratic passions. What I discovered instead was far more unsettling and magnificent. Americans had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made freedom work precisely by limiting it. This paradox struck me like a lightning bolt. Here was a people who voluntarily constrained their own liberty to preserve it, who embraced equality while fiercely protecting individual rights, who submitted to majority rule while maintaining sacred spaces of dissent. This wasn't the chaotic democracy European aristocrats feared, nor the oppressive equality socialist theorists promised. It was something entirely new, a society that had learned the most shocking truth about freedom, that it survives only when citizens willingly accept the discipline necessary to sustain it. Today, as democratic societies worldwide struggle with polarization and institutional decay, this American discovery about freedom's true nature becomes more urgent than ever. Chapter 1: The Paradox of Voluntary Constraint. What struck me most profoundly during my travels across America was how a people so passionate about liberty had learned to embrace constraint. This was not the constraint imposed by kings or aristocrats, but something far more sophisticated, the voluntary limitation of individual desires for the preservation of collective freedom. In New England townships, I witnessed citizens gathering in simple meeting halls, engaging in heated debates about local affairs. Yet beneath the apparent chaos lay an invisible discipline. These Americans had internalized rules of democratic engagement that no European constitution could have imposed. They listened, truly listened, to opposing viewpoints not from politeness, but from a deep understanding that their own freedom depended on protecting the freedom of those who disagreed with them. Consider the remarkable institution of trial by jury, which Americans elevated beyond mere legal procedure into a school of democratic citizenship. Every citizen called to jury service temporarily set aside personal interests to deliberate on matters affecting strangers. They weighed evidence, debated with fellow citizens from different backgrounds, and reached decisions that bound the community. This wasn't just about justice, it was about practicing the daily discipline that makes freedom sustainable. I observed how American voluntary associations operated with similar self-imposed constraints. Religious congregations, charitable societies, and civic organizations all required members to subordinate individual preferences to collective purposes. Yet paradoxically, this voluntary submission to group discipline expanded rather than contracted individual liberty. By learning to work within constraints they had chosen, Americans developed capacities for self-governance that no amount of abstract rights could provide. The genius of American freedom lay in recognizing that liberty without discipline becomes license, and license inevitably destroys the conditions that make freedom possible. Europeans, steeped in aristocratic traditions of command and obedience, couldn't fathom how a people could freely choose limitations on their freedom. We assumed constraint always came from above, imposed by those with power over those without it. Americans discovered that the most powerful constraints are those we impose on ourselves through democratic deliberation and voluntary association. This voluntary embrace of limitation wasn't weakness but wisdom. Americans understood intuitively what political theorists struggled to articulate, that unlimited freedom for some means no freedom for others, and that sustainable liberty requires citizens capable of balancing personal desires with public responsibilities. They had learned to make freedom work by refusing to make it absolute. Chapter 2: The Tyranny of Conformity Lurking Within. Yet beneath this remarkable achievement lay a darker discovery that both fascinated and alarmed me. While Americans had mastered the art of voluntary political constraint, they had simultaneously created a new form of tyranny more subtle and potentially more dangerous than any monarch's rule, the tyranny of public opinion. In aristocratic societies, dissent was possible because authority was fragmented. A thinker could find protection under one noble while opposing another, or appeal to religious authority against secular power. But in democratic America, I discovered a monolithic force more irresistible than any king, the unified will of the majority, expressed through public opinion and social pressure. Americans, I observed, were remarkably free to think differently in private but found it nearly impossible to express nonconforming ideas publicly without facing social ostracism. The majority didn't need to outlaw dissent, it simply made dissent socially unbearable. This was tyranny perfected, operating not through force but through the psychological pressure of social isolation. I witnessed this phenomenon in countless small communities where anyone who challenged prevailing orthodoxies found themselves gradually excluded from social and economic life. No laws were broken, no rights formally violated, yet the practical effect was more complete than any legal persecution. The dissenter faced a choice: conform or become a social exile in their own community. This democratic despotism was particularly insidious because it operated through mechanisms Americans considered expressions of freedom. Public opinion formed through free discussion, but that discussion was subtly bounded by unstated assumptions about what respectable people could think. Social pressure emerged from voluntary associations, but those associations gradually excluded perspectives that challenged group consensus. The irony was stunning. The very institutions that made American freedom possible, civic associations, public debate, democratic participation, also created new forms of intellectual and social tyranny. Americans had gained political liberty while potentially losing something even more precious: intellectual independence and the courage to stand alone against popular prejudice. I noticed how this conformist pressure was particularly strong in matters of religion, morality, and social customs. While Americans enjoyed extraordinary political freedoms, they seemed increasingly unable to question fundamental assumptions about proper behavior, acceptable beliefs, and social arrangements. The majority had become not just politically sovereign but intellectually supreme. This discovery troubled me deeply because it revealed how democratic freedom could undermine itself through its own success. The very unanimity that made democratic governance possible also threatened the diversity of thought and independent spirit that democracy needed to remain vital. Americans had solved the problem of political tyranny only to create a more subtle but potentially more comprehensive tyranny of social conformity. The challenge was clear: how could democratic societies preserve the benefits of majority rule while protecting the intellectual freedom and moral courage necessary for democratic renewal? Chapter 3: The Genius of Civic Associations. Yet as I delved deeper into American society, I discovered the antidote to democratic tyranny hiding in plain sight: the extraordinary proliferation of voluntary associations that mediated between individual and majority, creating spaces where freedom could flourish even under conformist pressure. Americans, I marveled, were constantly forming associations. For every conceivable purpose: charitable, religious, moral, educational, commercial, political, they gathered with fellow citizens to pursue shared goals. These associations served as buffers between the isolated individual and the overwhelming force of majority opinion, providing alternative sources of identity, purpose, and social support. In these voluntary groups, I witnessed Americans learning the practical arts of democratic citizenship. They practiced debate, compromise, and collective decision-making on a small scale where individual voices could still be heard and influential. A person who might feel powerless before the national majority could find purpose and agency within a local congregation, charitable society, or civic organization. These associations also served as schools of freedom, teaching Americans how to balance individual rights with collective responsibilities. Members learned to articulate their views persuasively, listen to opposing arguments, and find common ground with people from different backgrounds. Most importantly, they discovered that effective collective action required voluntary self-discipline, the same principle that made democratic governance possible. I was particularly struck by how these associations created alternative hierarchies based on merit, dedication, and service rather than birth or wealth. A shopkeeper could become president of a charitable society, a farmer could lead a religious congregation, a young professional could organize a civic improvement association. These leadership opportunities developed democratic capacities while providing alternatives to purely political ambition. The genius of American associational life lay in its ability to fragment and channel majority power. Instead of one monolithic public opinion, associations created multiple publics with different concerns, values, and perspectives. This diversity made tyrannical unanimity more difficult while preserving the benefits of democratic participation. Religious associations deserve special attention because they perform the crucial function of maintaining moral standards independent of political authority. While European governments struggled to balance religious freedom with social order, American religious associations voluntarily took responsibility for moral education and community welfare. They provided ethical foundations for democratic life without requiring state enforcement. Professional and commercial associations similarly created spaces where Americans could pursue excellence and innovation while maintaining independence from political control. These groups fostered the spirit of enterprise and improvement that characterized American society while protecting economic freedom from democratic leveling. Most remarkably, these associations taught Americans that freedom required active participation rather than passive consumption of rights. Members couldn't simply enjoy benefits, they had to contribute time, energy, and resources to collective purposes. This participation developed the civic virtues necessary for democratic self-governance while preventing the apathy and isolation that threatened democratic societies. Through voluntary association, Americans had discovered how to make freedom sustainable by creating multiple centers of authority and belonging that prevented any single force, whether government or majority opinion, from completely dominating social life. Chapter 4: The Solitary Individual in Democratic Society. However, my prolonged observation revealed a troubling undercurrent beneath American associational vigor, the emergence of a new kind of human being shaped by democratic equality, the isolated individual, cut off from traditional bonds yet struggling to find meaningful connection in an egalitarian society. In aristocratic societies, individuals were embedded within networks of mutual obligation and hereditary connection. A peasant knew his place, but he also knew his protections and relationships. The noble enjoyed privileges, but also accepted duties to those beneath him. These relationships, however unjust, provided meaning, security, and social identity that transcended individual existence. Democratic equality dissolved these traditional bonds, leaving individuals remarkably free but also remarkably alone. Americans, I observed, enjoyed unprecedented autonomy to choose their associations, occupations, and beliefs. Yet this freedom came at a psychological cost that few fully understood: the burden of constant self-creation in a society that provided few inherited guidelines for living. This democratic individualism manifested in fascinating ways. Americans changed careers, moved between regions, and formed new relationships with extraordinary ease. They displayed entrepreneurial energy and innovative thinking precisely because they weren't bound by traditional expectations. Yet beneath this dynamism, I detected a persistent anxiety about identity and belonging that aristocratic societies never experienced. The American individual faced choices that medieval peasants couldn't imagine: what work to pursue, what beliefs to hold, what community to join, even what identity to assume. This freedom was exhilarating but also exhausting. Without inherited roles and relationships, each person bore responsibility for creating their own meaning and purpose, a burden that could become overwhelming. I noticed how this individualism affected family relationships, which became more affectionate and voluntary but also more fragile and uncertain. American parents and children enjoyed greater emotional intimacy than their European counterparts, yet they also experienced more anxiety about their obligations to one another. Democracy had transformed family life from a system of fixed duties into a realm of negotiated relationships. The workplace revealed similar patterns. American employers and employees related with greater equality and mutual respect than I witnessed in Europe, yet they also maintained more tenuous and calculating relationships. Democratic equality made exploitation more difficult but also made lasting loyalty and paternalistic care less common. Most troubling was the psychological effect of constant choice and self-responsibility. Americans seemed perpetually dissatisfied, always seeking better opportunities and improved circumstances. This restlessness drove remarkable innovation and social mobility, but it also prevented the contentment and acceptance that came from knowing one's fixed place in a stable social order. The danger was that democratic individualism could become so extreme that citizens lost the capacity for sustained commitment to anything beyond immediate self-interest. If every relationship was voluntary and provisional, if every belief was subject to revision, if every community was merely instrumental, then the social bonds necessary for democratic governance might dissolve entirely. I observed Americans struggling with this tension between freedom and belonging, constantly forming associations while also maintaining the right to withdraw from them. They wanted the benefits of community without surrendering the autonomy that democracy promised. This balancing act required new virtues and new institutions that could provide stability without crushing individual liberty. Chapter 5: Religion as Democracy's Invisible Foundation. During my extensive travels, I made a discovery that confounded European expectations about democratic society. Religion thrived in America not despite political freedom, but because of it. Here was democracy's most shocking secret: it required moral foundations that politics alone could never provide, and Americans had found those foundations in voluntary religious commitment. European intellectuals assumed that democratic enlightenment would inevitably weaken religious faith. Educated citizens, we believed, would abandon superstition for rational self-governance. Yet in America, I encountered a vibrant religious culture that coexisted peacefully with political liberty and actually strengthened democratic institutions. The key was voluntary choice. American churches commanded authority not through state establishment or inherited privilege, but through their ability to attract and retain members who could freely choose alternatives. This competition forced religious institutions to serve their communities effectively while maintaining high moral standards. Churches that failed to meet spiritual needs simply lost members to more effective alternatives. I observed how this voluntary religious culture performed essential functions for democratic society. Churches provided moral education that taught citizens to balance personal desires with public responsibilities. They fostered habits of cooperation, mutual aid, and civic engagement that extended far beyond congregational life. Most importantly, they maintained standards of ethical behavior independent of political authority or majority opinion. Religious communities also served as training grounds for democratic leadership. Laypeople learned to speak publicly, organize collective action, and resolve disputes through peaceful deliberation. These skills transferred directly to political participation, creating citizens capable of effective self-governance. Many American political leaders first developed their public capacities through religious involvement. The diversity of American religious life was equally crucial. Multiple denominations competed for adherents, preventing any single religious authority from dominating society. This pluralism taught Americans to tolerate disagreement while maintaining personal convictions, precisely the balance democratic citizenship required. Citizens learned to live peacefully with neighbors who held different beliefs while preserving their own faith commitments. Perhaps most remarkably, American religion provided transcendent purpose that politics couldn't supply. Democratic societies faced the constant danger that citizens would lose themselves in material pursuits or political conflicts, forgetting higher purposes that made life meaningful. Religious faith directed attention beyond immediate self-interest toward eternal values that relativized temporal concerns. This religious foundation also limited democratic excess. Believers who acknowledged divine authority were less likely to worship political leaders or treat majority will as ultimate truth. Religious conviction provided a check on democratic pride and a source of resistance against popular tyranny. Faith communities could maintain unpopular positions when they conflicted with divine commands. I noticed how religious voluntary associations were among the most effective institutions in American society. They organized relief for the poor, education for children, moral reform movements, and countless other civic improvements. These religious organizations accomplished through voluntary cooperation what European governments attempted through bureaucratic administration. The separation of church and state in America, rather than weakening religion, had actually strengthened it by forcing churches to depend on voluntary support rather than political privilege. This arrangement protected both religious freedom and political liberty while enabling religion to provide the moral infrastructure that democracy required. Yet I also perceived dangers in this religious voluntarism. If religious commitment became purely private and emotional, disconnected from public obligations, it might cease to provide the civic benefits democracy needed. The challenge was maintaining religion's public influence while preserving its voluntary character. Chapter 6: The Eternal Tension, Equality versus Liberty. At the heart of my American observations lay a fundamental discovery that illuminated democracy's deepest challenge, the irreconcilable tension between equality and liberty that would define the fate of democratic societies for generations to come. Americans worshipped equality with a passion that both impressed and alarmed me. They couldn't tolerate hereditary privileges, artificial distinctions, or unearned advantages that marked aristocratic societies. This egalitarian spirit drove remarkable social mobility, economic innovation, and political participation that made America dynamic and hopeful in ways Europe couldn't match. Yet I gradually recognized that equality and liberty, though both democratic values, often conflicted in practice. The pursuit of equality tempted citizens to use political power to level differences that arose from talent, effort, or fortune. Meanwhile, the exercise of liberty inevitably created inequalities as individuals made different choices and achieved different outcomes. I witnessed this tension most clearly in American attitudes toward wealth and success. Americans celebrated entrepreneurial achievement and individual advancement, yet they also harbored deep suspicion of anyone who rose too far above common levels. They wanted everyone to have equal opportunities while struggling to accept unequal results that flowed from those opportunities. The political implications were profound. Democratic majorities could vote to redistribute wealth, regulate successful enterprises, or restrict activities that created advantages for some citizens over others. The majority's commitment to equality could justify trampling on minority rights to property, association, or economic freedom. Liberty's greatest enemy might not be aristocratic privilege but democratic envy. I observed how this dynamic played out in local communities where successful individuals faced pressure to share their advantages or risk social ostracism. Americans had eliminated formal aristocracy only to create informal pressures against anyone who stood out too prominently from common levels. The result was a subtle but powerful force for conformity that operated through social rather than political mechanisms. Economic policy revealed similar tensions. Americans wanted free markets that rewarded merit and effort, but they also wanted outcomes that didn't create excessive inequality. They celebrated competition while worrying about its effects on social cohesion. They praised individual success while fearing its impact on democratic equality. The danger was that democratic societies might sacrifice liberty for equality, gradually expanding government power to ensure equal outcomes rather than equal opportunities. Citizens might trade freedom for security, accepting bureaucratic control in exchange for protection from market uncertainties and competitive pressures. Yet I also discovered that American federalism provided a partial solution to this fundamental tension. Different states and localities could experiment with different balances between equality and liberty, allowing citizens to choose communities that matched their preferences. This diversity prevented any single approach from dominating the entire society while maintaining space for different democratic experiments. The genius of American constitutionalism lay in its attempt to protect both equality and liberty through institutional design. Checks and balances prevented majorities from quickly implementing extreme policies in either direction. Individual rights limited what democratic governments could do, while democratic processes ensured that those rights remained responsive to popular will. Still, I recognize that no institutional design could permanently resolve the tension between equality and liberty. Each generation would face this fundamental choice anew, and their decisions would determine whether democratic societies preserved freedom while promoting equality, or sacrificed one value for the other. The American experiment in democratic governance was ultimately an experiment in managing this eternal tension. Success required citizens capable of balancing competing values through ongoing political engagement rather than seeking final solutions through constitutional formulas or ideological commitments. Chapter 7: Freedom's Future in the Modern Democratic Age. As I reflect on America's democratic experiment from the perspective of nearly 2 centuries, I see both vindication of my hopes and confirmation of my fears about freedom's fate in modern democratic society. The principles I observed in 1830s America have been tested by challenges I could scarcely imagine, yet the fundamental dynamics of democratic freedom remain remarkably consistent. Modern technology has intensified both the promises and perils of democratic equality. Digital communication enables unprecedented participation in public discourse, allowing every citizen to broadcast opinions and organize with like-minded individuals across vast distances. Yet these same technologies have created new forms of the tyranny of majority opinion I witnessed in small American towns, now operating at global scale with algorithmic amplification. Social media platforms demonstrate how democratic discourse can simultaneously expand and contract intellectual freedom. Citizens enjoy access to more information and diverse perspectives than ever before, yet they also face subtle pressures toward conformity through like-based validation and algorithmic filtering that creates echo chambers more complete than any I observed in 19th century communities. The voluntary associations that impressed me as bulwarks against democratic tyranny have evolved in ways both encouraging and troubling. Americans continue forming countless organizations for civic, charitable, and political purposes, yet many of these associations now operate virtually rather than through face-to-face interaction that builds democratic character. The art of listening to disagreement and finding common ground, skills I watched Americans develop in town meetings and religious congregations, becomes more difficult when mediated through digital interfaces. Economic changes have similarly intensified the tension between equality and liberty that I identified as democracy's central challenge. Global markets have created opportunities for entrepreneurship and mobility that exceed anything 19th century Americans could imagine. Yet they have also generated inequalities that threaten social cohesion and democratic legitimacy. The question I posed about whether democratic societies could maintain both equal opportunities and unequal outcomes has become more urgent as technological change accelerates economic disruption. Religious freedom, which I identified as crucial for democracy's moral foundation, faces new tests in increasingly diverse societies. American religious pluralism has expanded to include traditions I never encountered, yet this expansion has also weakened the shared moral vocabulary that enabled democratic deliberation. The challenge now is maintaining space for transcendent values while accommodating unprecedented diversity of belief and practice. Perhaps most significantly, The individualism I observed as both democracy's strength and its danger has reached extremes that alarm even sympathetic observers. Americans today enjoy personal autonomy that surpasses anything previous generations could imagine, yet they also experience isolation and meaninglessness that threaten the social bonds necessary for democratic governance. The voluntary associations that once mediated between individual and society have weakened, leaving many citizens politically connected but socially atomized. Yet I also see encouraging signs that Americans retain the capacity for democratic renewal that impressed me during my original journey. New forms of civic engagement emerge as old ones decline. Younger generations display both sophisticated understanding of democratic institutions and passionate commitment to democratic values, even as they question traditional forms of political participation. The fundamental insight I gained from studying American democracy remains valid. Freedom survives only when citizens actively participate in the demanding work of self-governance. This requires not just voting or expressing opinions, but developing the civic virtues and democratic capacities that make collective self-rule possible. Americans must continually rediscover how to balance individual liberty with social responsibility, equality with excellence, majority rule with minority rights. The shocking discovery about American freedom that transformed my understanding in the 1830s remains relevant today. Sustainable liberty requires voluntary self-constraint, active civic engagement, and constant vigilance against both political tyranny and social conformity. Democracy's greatest achievement is teaching citizens to preserve freedom by limiting it through democratic deliberation and voluntary association. Conclusion. My journey through America revealed democracy's most profound secret. Freedom flourishes not when unlimited but when voluntarily constrained by citizens who understand that their liberty depends on protecting the liberty of others. This shocking discovery, that Americans had learned to make freedom work by limiting it through democratic engagement and civic association, challenged everything Europeans believed about the relationship between equality and liberty. Today, as democratic societies worldwide face challenges I could scarcely imagine, technological disruption, global inequality, cultural fragmentation, and political polarization, the American experiment in self-governance remains humanity's best hope for preserving freedom while promoting equality. Yet this hope depends entirely on citizens willing to embrace the demanding work of democratic citizenship, listening to disagreement, participating in civic life, maintaining voluntary associations, and balancing personal desires with public responsibilities. The future of freedom rests not in constitutional formulas or technological solutions, but in each generation's willingness to rediscover and renew the civic virtues that make democratic self-governance possible. Democracy is not a political system but a way of life, and like all forms of life, it requires constant care, attention, and renewal by those who would preserve it for future generations.